Welcome to Community Capital, a podcast about visionary founders and dedicated community builders who are shaping the future one connection at a time. I'm your host, Zara Nukvi, Head of Founder Community at Republic. Well, thank you so much, Steph, for being here. I'm so excited to chat with you about everything that you've accomplished and built so far with PIN, of course. And I think the first thing that I kind of want our audience to know is that you're like incredibly accomplished in terms of your background.
Honestly, like far too much credit, but thank you.
Honestly, I think obviously having been an investor like at NEA and then having the investment banking experience, going to U Chicago, having a Stanford MBA, it's almost like exactly I think what people think of when they think of founders who have like such a great background. And so I guess like having had all those experiences, did you know you wanted to be a founder like early on in life, or what was the path that led you to being a founder?
It's so funny to hear you position it that way, because I could not look back on my career time to date and think of it as more like luck or happenstance. And to think that all prepared me to be a founder is mind blowing, because being a founder is so hard. And I wouldn't say that my background at all is perfect for it, so it's very flattering to even hear that. But I think I've always wanted to be a founder in some ways. I think I was pretty entrepreneurial growing up. I had a really nerdy hobby for a while of inventing things, and part of that was because of a school project, and then it kind of escalated into something I did with my dad, and so I kind of was familiar with entrepreneurship in that regard. But then kind of the rest of my career I felt was me chasing risk aversion, because I was almost too afraid to do the thing that I really wanted to do. And so if anything, I advise people not to do the traditional path that I followed, and instead if you want to be a founder, go for it more directly, whereas I think I took a very long winding path to get there.
Yeah, and then I always love to ask founders, what was the moment or a set of moments where you were like, I'm doing this, if it was leaving your full-time job, or when you recognized that PIN had to be built, did you have one moment where you were like, this needs to happen, I need to just go for it, shoot my shot, or was it a kind of gradual build over time?
Yeah, so the story behind PIN was interesting. It started off as a side project that we did at Stanford. Literally never thought it was going to turn into anything. We launched that in 2020, kind of was getting started. And then, funnily enough, I literally spent a year and a half working on a completely different startup of my own in the fitness space. Could not be more different than PIN.
Oh, wow.
And it was funny, actually, when I was working on that, obviously as a founder, you're dedicating 99% of your time on that one thing. But because of the side project and some articles that had come out about it, we were getting all these emails all the time from people who basically wanted to replicate that side project that we did at Stanford. And I think it was just, working in fitness and consumer, as you know, which is really hard. We were dying to get customers and people to retain using our free product. Meanwhile, we were getting all of these emails from folks who were begging us for help to set up this thing that I literally didn't even think of as a company. And in some ways, I think that was kind of the light bulb moment for me, where it felt like I was forcing something that wasn't happening with the fitness company. I think my background also is not a great fit for that. I'm probably one of the least fit people that you know, honestly. Whereas the investing thing, it came from a true passion. I did it with no intent of profit whatsoever. And I think just given my background as an investor and wanting to make it more understandable and accessible to people made it something much more kind of it was better founder company fit, I think is the term. So that was kind of the moment, but it was again a very long winding process to get there.
Yeah. So I always love to ask founders, okay, you had the moment, you decided you were going to go for it. I always find it really fascinating, because I feel like we hear a lot of stories where you had the moment and then the company was made, the product was made, but I always love to hear what was the first thing you decided to do when you were going to go forward? Was it building out the product, building out the brand, coming up with a name, getting the legal entity formed? And it could have all just happened at once, but I just am fascinated by the idea of what was the first thing the founder decided to do when they were going to go after it?
Yeah, I think my situation was weird because, again, I was working on this old company in a wildly different space. We had raised our seed round 6 months prior to that, so not that long. And when we had this moment of clarity, I was kind of in a panic for a little bit about, wanting to do it and feeling in my gut that it was the right thing, but not wanting to make it or make a decision too hastily. And so I felt like it was kind of complicated, but I think once I fully decided to pull the trigger, I just knew that I needed to tell my investors immediately. And for literally the first step was hey, I've decided on this, and I want you guys on this journey because I love you guys so much. But I understand it's wildly different than what you signed up for. And to my surprise, I think 85% of our investors ended up staying. Some of our other investors who were like, dead set on the fitness space. Obviously, we parted ways with very amicably, but it was really flattering to know that a lot of folks who had backed me the first time was excited about this random idea that they had never heard of, even though they signed up for something very different.
Yeah. And so even touching on the investors then, I also feel like it's such a unique, actually, I just think it's such a unique kind of perspective to have like the investor experience and then go into the founding, because I feel like you do really understand what like the VCs are thinking. And so when it came to your fundraising process, you raised an incredible round with incredible investors. How was that fundraising process for you? How did you go about it in terms of I guess raising the round itself, but then also positioning PIN in a manner in which like you knew as a VC in your past what VCs wanted to see, I guess?
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like people ask me all the time, what did you get the most out of, or what did your experience in VC benefit you the most in? And I think the most obvious thing is fundraising, but weirdly, I think it helped me a little bit, but not as much as people would expect. So I'd say some things that I knew immediately was, I think VCs have like a very strong grasp over like, is this even like a venture backable idea or not? And I think one of the biggest mistakes that people make is like they pitch something that could be really lucrative and make a lot of money, but is not the risk profile type of company that a VC wants to back. And so I think in that regard, the psychology, and to your point, understanding the VC perspective was really helpful. But actually, weirdly, I think being in VC more than anything just gave me self-confidence. I think, maybe you probably relate to this having met a bunch of founders, but at the end of the day, I think founders are just normal people who just have like a little bit more maybe like perseverance or bias for action to actually like pull the trigger and do it. And so I think coming from New Jersey and suburban small town where like not a lot of people did the Silicon Valley venture-backed thing, working in VC and meeting all these folks on a daily basis and realizing like, oh, they're normal people and this is much more accessible, was actually the biggest kind of boost to my personal career in entrepreneurship, more than like fundraising knowledge, which I think everyone can pick up pretty easily.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess also touching on the founder communities and the investor communities and the fact that PIN is so rooted in community, I always love to ask founders, was there like a community that you did rely on when you were first like in the early stages of building PIN? And I guess what does community mean to you? We'll definitely get into like what community means for PIN, but what does it just mean for you in general in this ecosystem to have a community or be part of one?
Yeah, so I think it's more important to me than ever, especially because I'm a solo founder. It's so funny, my entrepreneurial journey has been so winding over 3.5 years, which isn't even that long in the span of things for a lot of people. But to think about where this all started, which was like Stanford GSB, my class, I knew I went to GSB basically to start a company, and I was like working on ideas from the very beginning. And it's like really my classmates who were there for me in the early days of like beta testing all of my bad ideas, introducing me to potential co-founders, like workshopping stuff with me in classes as I was pursuing that. And it's so funny now to kind of come full circle where we raised that fund for our class. That was kind of the side project I referenced earlier, and then now kind of coming full circle when I created PIN as a full company, and we raised our round, and they actually invested in me. It was kind of this really fun full circle moment where I was like, oh, we're really solidifying that community feel. And I think something that I really love is like I still lean on them a lot today. Like they're my first email, text, call. Like if I need something, we're launching on Product Hunt tomorrow when we release this episode or whatever, things like that. Like we are eager to kind of get them involved, and they're not only excited to support as like investors, but really kind of as like friends and family at this point. And as you know, I'm sure being a founder in general, I think is just a lonely journey, even if you have a co-founder. But especially for me, I think they are like my co-founder in some ways. So community, I think, means extra to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I guess kind of pivoting to the community from like the perspective of PIN, I think the reason we're really excited about having this podcast and talking about community capital and what it means and the future of just businesses that are rooted in community is the fact that I think the customer and the consumer has kind of changed in terms of what they want to see from businesses, and a huge part of that is community, of course. So I always love to ask founders, PIN is so rooted in community in terms of like literally the like ethos of the business and the product itself. Yeah. And so when you were first building, I guess, the community aspect and you were first acquiring those first users, how did you get them, I guess, like up to speed and start to like get the community to snowball from when you first started out acquiring those first few users?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and also tying this back to your earlier question in terms of like how we kind of positioned ourselves for the raise, I always knew that one of the biggest pieces of pushback from people in general, but especially from investors, was like, oh, well, this was a great idea, and you did one MVP at Stanford, but how does this scale to all other types of communities? And so my first kind of road to kind of proving that wrong was actually going to other communities and essentially co-founding those communities myself. And so similar to how I kind of started the Stanford one as a student, like, literally talking to every single person and getting them on board and investing and handling all of that, I did that with other communities as well, whether it was other business schools or the Coinbase community, creators, or other communities of people who I thought would be really great fits for what we're building. And I essentially was the one doing all of those calls and fundraising, if you will. And then I think it kind of takes off. Like, something that gives me a lot of excitement is seeing that once a community is established, they tend to get picked up again for the next cohort really quickly. Like Stanford, there's a new one every single year. We're seeing the same thing at companies who are kind of raising for different cohorts. YC just renewed theirs for a second one. And so it's exciting to see this pattern pick up. Like, once people do it once, both founders and members really love it, and they are eager to do it again. So it gives me a lot of encouragement.
That's amazing. And I guess a lot of our listeners are founders, but then we also have like the investors and the VCs and the investors who are part of the Republic community. And so, not to ask you to do a pitch, but I would love for you to even just take a minute to explain like what PIN is and potentially how like our listeners can get involved with it and set up their own communities to start investing as well.
Yeah, oh man, I feel like you'll have to constrain me to a minute. But the high level of PIN is that we are essentially building the infrastructure, the legal admin tax work in a box for anyone who basically wants to start a group investing vehicle. And so, as you mentioned, we're super community oriented. I'd say most of the groups that we serve are school alum or company alum, especially for like growth stage or unicorn status companies at this point, Republic maybe in the future, whose alum and employee bases come together to invest in next generation founders, creators and their followers, VC funds expanding to create scout programs and pulling in other community members to invest with them, et cetera. We basically do all the infrastructure related to that. And I think what makes us really different as well is that we care a lot about the connection piece. So our product actually enables like the members themselves to actually connect with one another. And it's been awesome to see our communities flourish. Like, not only are they kind of in this investing vehicle together, but they build relationships with each other. They become co-founders and partners and start new companies. And then also for founder member connection. So like, me as a founder, I mentioned earlier that I rely a lot on my Stanford GSB classmates, and I still do that today. Whenever we have something new, we have a push through PIN where everyone can kind of respond and help with really simple tasks through our app. And so I'd say if people want to get involved, start a community for whatever alum group that you're part of or around a cause that you really care about.
Yeah. And I guess also pivoting to the way that people perceive community from like a building and public perspective, I think you've done such an incredible job with that, particularly on Twitter, where I think a lot of people associate. I think you like ask thought-provoking questions. You have great memes that you share as well that people heavily resonate with. And so when it comes to this like concept of building in public, whenever people bring that up, particularly from the founder perspective, I do think of you first. You're like one of the first people I think of. Yeah. And so when it came to, I guess this is a very specific question, but when it came to like Twitter and thinking about like yourself as like building in public as a founder, like how did you think that was going to like catch fire the way that it did in terms of like everyone being really enthusiastic about all of your content, or like I guess how did you think about it when you were thinking about like tweeting and kind of getting started with the building in public?
Yeah, so Twitter was literally a bet amongst me and my co-working teammates back in September, and part of it was the bet of us having fun. Part of it was I have really wanted to build in public or post publicly for quite some time. I think it's partly from my VC background and having a lot of peers, some who had really leaned into that and some who didn't, and me feeling more and more every year that people who had leaned into it really benefited. You can source great deals or financially it can be really beneficial, but I think more than anything, and I definitely realize this now, the more that you put yourself out there, the more that you serve as a lighthouse that attracts like-minded people. Like in some examples, that's how we met via Twitter, right? Yeah. We probably wouldn't have, or maybe we would have, but it would have taken a lot longer had that not happened. And so that was kind of part of it. And then I think when it started getting some traction, people would text me and encourage me, like that was actually enough for me to keep going. Whereas I think before I was so worried about pushing something to the public and having no one respond or getting really, bad responses or other things. But I'm realizing also like no one cares, like I do post all the time and a lot of them do poorly and no one really cares. And so I think it's just riskless in some ways to do it, and it's gotten so much more benefit, whether it's like people who care about PIN who've started companies or communities, because of that, all the way to like meeting great people who are other members of the ecosystem who I hope to build really long-lasting relationships with, like you guys. And so I would recommend anyone who has interest in doing it to just do it.
For sure. And I mean, I think even just going back to like the way that community has had such an impact in like your development and the PIN's development, I always love to ask founders now that they've gone through like the first round of fundraising and they have like they've built this community of investors. I think we're starting to see like the VC ecosystem change where the investors on the cap table are community and like you're asking them for help. It's less of a like they're just on the cap table and that's kind of it. It's more like they're very much integrated, they're very involved, and we're just starting to see that sentiment I think become even more popular, which I think like justifies things like PIN existing, Republic, like all of that. How has it been just like to have that community of investors and VCs that have invested in you kind of like exist as a community that you can also like rely on when it comes to advice or just taking the company forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's, we're so aligned there. I feel like it's not only like comforting on a personal level, and I view them in some ways, like I mentioned, like my co-founder, for emotional support, but also for like literally accelerating our own growth and growth as a company, right? It's a really powerful tool, and I think you probably have seen this, like, and also PIN stands for power in numbers, hence our name, but I think there is a huge benefit of having a large group of passionate people on your cap table who are really aligned with what you're doing and who are literally incentive aligned because they're investors in you to help you, right? And so I think what PIN does really well is like we gamify the process and make it really fun. And this is advice I've gotten as well from other founders is like if you want your investors to help, it's one, ask for very specific things, and then two, have like a leaderboard or shout outs at the end of your investor email because everyone loves recognition and wants to almost like win that piece. And so I think PIN does that in a really fun, organic way, but literally they're our biggest superpower, if you will. It's something that I think very few other companies have, or like I think because of PIN now, we're able to kind of share that ability for more companies to have it. But you know, historically, and I'd say before PIN, I didn't have this kind of community easily accessible for me. So for me, it's been a huge game changer. Yeah,
and I have two last questions. I think the first one is when it comes to the fundraising process. We've asked so many founders on the podcast so far, like what are your top 3 pieces of advice, and we've heard like getting your deck like really succinct and like getting like the warm outbound stuff like really kind of solved before you go into the process. But I feel like you're actually the first person we've had who has the VC experience and has been a founder. So when it comes to like, I guess 3 things that you've learned in hindsight of the fundraising process, what are those like tips that you would maybe have like change, or things that you did correctly that you think like other founders should definitely do as well when it comes to fundraising?
Yeah, oh man, I mean, I could literally go on for a long time about this, and I quite literally have like a 30-page guide on this, but I think the first thing is cheesy but true. The first is like to put your mindset in the right spot and really think about fundraising as being a search problem and not a persuasion problem, meaning like you really should be thinking about it as a numbers game. I think far too many people get discouraged because they have conversations and then they get rejected obviously early on, and you know, I think not enough founders are going to push through that phase or try again because of that. I think related to that, actually, number 2, I'd say a no is not a permanent no. The number of times that I've seen people go back to investors, even within a few weeks, right? Because a lot can happen in a few weeks, whether it's like you're in an accelerator program and things change dramatically and you accelerate growth, or you pivot to a new idea, or like the market changes and suddenly there's an open opportunity. The number of times that I've heard from my friends who've gone back to those same investors and had those people say yes later is humongous. And so I'd say, you know, never take no's personally, but also don't take them as a permanent sign. And then I think the last thing is, I think for me, when I always an advocate for practice in general, and of course you want to practice with VCs, but I think the safest way for me to practice, was to practice with founders. And like, you can be very strategic about the types of founders that you go out with, but I definitely started with founder friends, but then moved to people who were slightly ahead of me, say like Series A, Series B founders, maybe who were in fintech, maybe not competitive with PIN or even like, you know, in our direct space, but who had kind of like a gauge of what VCs ask for in the fintech world or how they might gauge this, or especially founders who have raised recently who can give you a little bit more of an accurate market sentiment, which I think actually matters more than people expect. I'd say those are my top 3, but yeah, I could go on for a really long time about that.
And then my last question is, when it comes to like your experience as a founder. It's definitely a hard question, and everyone always explains their answer, so feel free to do so. But if you could use one word to describe being a founder, what would that word be?
Like unpredictable. Yeah, I just think that's probably like the main word I would describe this experience, in the sense that every day is different, every month is different, and even things like, I think fundraising, obviously we've talked a lot about, but unexpected things happen all the time, and I'd say like we raised at a really good time, for example, but if we raise at another time, like things could have ended really differently. So I think luck plays a lot of role in things too, and so I think unpredictable is what I would just sum it up as, but it's also, you know, if you play the long game, in some ways you can smooth out the unpredictable and make a great journey of it, which we're lucky to be on. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. It was so good hearing all of your feedback. I know all of our listeners are really going to value everything you shared.
Thank you for having me. This is so fun.